Hi, this is Joe Masek. I am your instructor and I'm doing a little presentation about using primary sources, what the differences between primary and secondary. Hopefully this will help you in this paper and in future papers. Think about primary sources. What is it? What do you think is a primary source? A primary source is an original document or object which was created at the time under study. A primary source is not the source that you use the most for your paper, but an original document. For example, if you are writing about the United States history and the Declaration of Independence, the original document, 1776, that would be your primary source because it's an original document. However, a secondary source are accounts or interpretations of that document. In other words, a textbook that wrote about the Declaration of Independence, that would be a secondary source. So for example, your textbook, even though you probably get most of the information from your textbook, that is a secondary source. It's an interpretation of what others have said using first-hand information. In other words, the authors were not there at the time of these particular events. And that's the difference between primary and secondary. Primary was there, secondary is an interpretation of someone who was there. Why do you want to use primary sources? Well, one, it develops critical thinking skills, and it also lets you construct the knowledge from what was said or done at that particular time. And it's also the source of valid information. You may have different interpretations from people who were there. In other words, different viewpoints. A diary, for example, of an individual who lived during a particular time frame. And you have several of these diaries, and you put them together, and you have a paper or your paper that interprets what these individuals were going through. So you have a lot of information from people who were actually there. That's an awesome amount of knowledge that you have. So you can make your own interpretation of what these people went through. Different types of primary sources. One might be photographs. You also have written documents such as reports, different studies, letters from individuals. Also, maybe a movie clip. So movie clips are, because they were done at the time period, sound recordings. The Library of Congress has a wonderful bank of oral histories that was conducted, many of them during the 1930s, of individuals who recorded the history of individuals who lived during the late 1800s, early 1900s, and so forth. Maps of the time period. Let's see, and also, what else? What else might you think is a primary source? I mentioned diaries, letters, studies, and so forth. Something that was done at that time during that particular event. In our digital age, we also want to think about websites. Are websites primary sources? Well, if it's maybe a personal blog, I have my personal blog, maybe I have my personal diary on a website, I post my thoughts, I post different events that happen on that particular day. That's a primary source because it happened, especially if it happened to me or if it had my interpretation of a particular event. So it really depends on a website. If it's a website such as a college website or school website that is talking about something that had happened at a particular time, then it's not a primary source. Remember, primary is at the time. Secondary sources would be books, magazines, newspapers. Again, these are usually interpretations. The television news program or these days on the website. If you watch Yahoo News or Google or something like that, MSN online, they have a lot of information, and usually news is secondary because it has an interpretation. On the other hand, if they interview someone who was actually there, part of that could be a primary source because that person tells you exactly what was going on. But you also have to be careful with that because it's not everything that the individual said. It's only part of what the individual said. You want all of the information. Tertiary sources, tertiary just means third, so that's like having the third removed, or the third layer. Encyclopedias, dictionaries, and almanacs are usually tertiary sources because they are interpretations of interpretation. An investigation occurs when you analyze your primary source by putting the primary source into context. In other words, what was going on at the time? Why is something significant? And comparing different information across different sources. For example, you have this picture here. In this particular picture, you see two men. They're standing over a pothole and cars in the background and so forth. What can you analyze from this primary source? This was a photo taken at the time period. You might look at the clothing. So what was the time frame? What were these women wearing? And what were women wearing during a particular time? That tells you this is a photograph of that time period. The cars, for example, what is the year that these particular styles of cars were in vogue? And you see a little tiny sign way back in the distance on that kind of on-ramp on that staircase. If I had a magic zoom lens, I would try to make that sign bigger and to try to read what that sign said. I would also look at what were these men doing. Here we have men who were smoking in public, and really that's not something that we do these days. And what type of equipment were they? Did they have? When were ropes, and that looks like a light, an old-fashioned flashlight, a manual of some type, and so forth. What was going on here, and how can you deduce what was going on from the equipment that was used? So there's quite a bit of investigation work that's going on in history or in looking at primary sources. So again, you can determine the time frame of the photograph from the objects in the photograph, and you can research further by investigating the origin of the photograph. Why was it taken? Who was involved? What were they doing? And so forth. So where did you find the photograph, for example? What kind of archive was it in? In other words, a storage area. Some primary, secondary, or even tertiary sources might be the online library. EBSCO is another one, Gale Research, ProQuest, company directories, SocIndex, PsycInfo, and even though it's not on here, Library of Congress has awesome information from primary documents, in other words, the documents that were written, the original documents, and also oral histories. So that's a great source to look at. Another one that's not on here that I do want to mention, and it has to do with Supreme Court rulings. I've used it in the past, and it's through Cornell University. If you just do a Google search, Cornell University Supreme Court rulings, it has the text of what the Supreme Court said, and also audio. In other words, what they said, the Supreme Court justices, and a transcription of what they said and how they rule. And in the audio version, you also get the two different sides that are discussing their particular points that they want to make to the Supreme Court. And that's really, really interesting. Some of those are rather long, 2 or some odd hours, but they are very interesting to listen to. Again, primary source because it was at the time of. Okay, here's a question for you. This is a quiz. And which do you think are primary and which do you think was it done at the time of the event? And if not, if it's an interpretation of, it's a secondary source. And then if it's an interpretation of an interpretation, it's a tertiary source. So you really want to watch out for those. In history, we always like to go for the primary source. In other words, what did the people who were living through that event, what did they say? What did they do? What do they think? And then we place our interpretation on that. Our interpretation would be a secondary source. I hope this was helpful in determining what a primary source and secondary source would be for you.